Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a nice week so far. Voluntarist Academy here. James Cordiner with Voluntarist Academy. If you're here, then you want to know more about how to be free. You want to know what's going on and what's going to bring about real freedom, which is practicing voluntarism. And let's learn about that together on this channel, shall we? Tonight, I want to introduce and start this presentation series of a book called Men Against the State by James J. Martin, and this is a wonderful book, and it was first published in hold on now, first published in 1957. So 1957, and the Expositors of Individualist Anarchism in America is the subtitle here. We're going to be looking at these individualist anarchists that existed between 1827 and 1908. Now, that being said, we will not be going through this nearly, this 300-page book in one evening. That is not going to happen. But what we will be doing is we'll be going through it over the course of several evenings. And we'll be having a deep dive history lesson here of these fine gentlemen. And so, without any further ado, I think we can go right over to the presentation. So, like the edition that I have on PDF is different than the one that I have in person. Copyright 1953, my bad. Not 1957. See? So the publication history, this was first published by Adrian Allen Associates in DeKalb, Illinois in April of 1953. It was republished by Libertarian Book Club, New York in April 1957, which is what I have, in both hardcover and paper cover printings. Published for the third time by Ralph Miles Publisher Incorporated of Colorado Springs, Colorado in April 1970. So, and that was published in a linotype composition, paper cover edition for the first time, incorporating minor changes. So we're going to be reading from that, the Ralph Miles Publisher with the minor changes. So I don't know what those minor changes are going to be yet, but hopefully nothing too drastic. Before we begin, like and subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the content or the presentations that I do. You can of course always get more of them by liking and subscribing, and turn on the notifications so when I go live, you will be directly notified. So, all right, let's start with the introduction. I'm planning on getting to at least, halfway through like the first part. So the first couple chapters, I think we can accomplish with no problem this evening. So the introduction, and here we go. The writing of a history of anarchism in the United States will run into the difficulties created by the necessity of establishing criteria for the purpose of separating anarchism from other expressions of radical social thought, which may be allied to but are distinct from it. On the verbal level, the most perplexing problem is that of definition of terms, beginning with the basic word itself. In one respect, the obstruction may never be bridged. An almost unusurpable barrier has been the matter of semantics. The use of the term as an identification for a social order characterized by the absence of the state is quite recent. As used by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in this way, it is hardly more than a century old. However, its association with reprehensibility in this country has generally greatly restricted its use for descriptive purposes. European radicals have been far less inhibited in this way. Hence, the study of anarchism there is relatively unimpeded by hesitancy on the part of radicals to disclose themselves. Their propaganda has been open and identified, and thus may be readily examined. The reluctance to openly declare positions, which has been a periodic matter of concern in all areas of radicalism in America, makes such an approach here out of the question. Thus, the problem of discovering anarchist literature and sentiments when disguised as something else. The constant use of less highly charged words to describe anarchist propaganda is still another situation which is essentially American. In such a way, anarchist doctrines have found acceptance here when identification as the former would have produced a general flight away from it. So sinister have been the associative connotations of the word. In view of such a situation, it is not peculiar that the study of anarchism involves the necessity of escaping the limits of the word itself. On the other hand, the indiscriminate use of the word makes it imperative that all professions of it be examined. A vast number of ideas which have nothing to do with anarchism are often purported to be such, resulting in distortion, deliberate or otherwise. It has been evident to thoughtful observers for more than 2 generations that the words anarchist, anarchism, and anarchy have been used so loosely by writers and the general public alike that they have practically ceased to have any definite meaning. The problem here is similar to that existing in many other cases where abstract terms or generalizations having no or little substance have been overused or misused. Nor has the use of these terms by scholars tended to promote any greater degree of understanding. In too many cases, the tendency has been to resemble the weaknesses of the general observer. Here, the situation has been usually created by the repeated interpretation of expressions of hostility to the status quo as evidence of anarchist thought. The idea has long been prevalent that violent conduct is characteristic of anarchists, and that anarchism is a doctrine of destruction. There exists little justification for such a stand in actuality. In addition, the rejection of one particular variety of authority in favor of its replacement by another finds continual identification with anarchism, while social philosophies, which are utterly opposed to it, are on occasion labeled anarchistic. This merely adds to the already large amount of confusion existing on the subject, letting up extremely vague limitations and permitting the inclusion of many elements which are quite controversial. Mere dissatisfaction with or opposition to the existing order anywhere is gravely insufficient to serve as evidence of anarchist sentiments. Nor is a program of pure negation or obstructionism more than faintly related. Anarchists are not advocates of replacing something with nothing. An example of presumption is the widespread interchangeable use of the terms nihilism and anarchism. Actually, the anarchist proposes specific solutions for social problems. His occasional tendency to mask them by encouraging the greater disintegration and decay of the older order may lead to identifying him with an element which desires planless, cumulative revolutionary disorder. But the anarchist and those enamored with perpetual revolutionary dynamism part company long before this. A history of anarchism, therefore, becomes progressively more difficult to undertake if it is assumed that all that has the appearance of anarchist philosophy as conventionally understood properly comes within the purview of such a study. Careful reflection on the issue leads one to observe that the loose application of the term anarchy as a synonym for chaos is a verbal reflex based on a conditioned semantic response. This patently ignores one of the fundamental principles on which most of the varied schools of belief in the ideal of the stateless society are grounded. The last century, with its all-pervading atmosphere of nationalism, has been especially hostile to such thinking, as was an earlier era of religious authoritarianism. And as the problems produced by the conflicting national policies have encouraged the elaboration of totalitarian schemes as solutions, the resistance to anarchistic thinking has grown apace. The belief that abolition of external coercion or control is an impossibility, or at best a probability of the most remote and impractical order, has prevailed, and is now virtually unquestioned. Even among those least satisfied with the structure of world society, the assumption that institutional government is absolutely necessary as a starting point is universally held. The fear of the disappearance of traditional values and modes of behavior thought worthy of preservation without the bulwark provided by institutionalism is expressed implicitly here. It can thus be seen that the peripheral area of anarchism becomes as extended as desired, depending upon the object sought. It is possible, for instance, to take a running start from the early 17th century, as has been done, recording the varied social protests since that time and sifting their content for what may have significance in the delineation of anti-statist thought. In addition, the writings of a great variety of thinkers from that time to this may be strained for quotations which have the semblance of anarchist sentiment and connotation when abstracted out of context. Thus, it becomes possible, as does Rudolf Rocker, to include even such personages as Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln on the fringe of the anarchist fold. It might be mentioned at this point that the area of overlapping of liberal and anarchist ideas is itself a full-scale study, which can only be indicated in such a work as this. Even such pertinent figures as William Godwin and Robert Owen can easily be overextended when one is engaged in elaborating the development of anarchism in the United States. And it has been remarked upon elsewhere that when considered from the point of view of a consistent school of thought, the radical writings of even Henry David Thoreau has far more pertinence to the abolitionist rather than the anarchist movement. Thoreau's pamphleteering was discovered by the radicals a generation after it had ceased, and the extent of Thoreau's anarchism is a highly debatable matter. With respect to the United States, especially, the stretching of the term anarchism to apply to all the variety of vague and dimly felt resentments toward authority which have been discerned in the history of American dissension from colonial New England days to the present is now questionable. It appears increasingly probable that expressions of well-organized arguments against the state date from the first quarter of the 19th century and represent more accurately a reaction to the complex problems produced by the growth of urbanism, industrialism, and the expansion of the modern national state. Observations of isolated expressions containing particles of anarchistic thought can be made, but the difficulty of presenting them in any logical sequence has yet to be surmounted. The element of relation or continuity is absent, and their contribution to a sustained integrated propaganda is tenuous at best. More often than not, they are isolated phenomena which lack any central theme or point of polarization. Since 1880 and thereabouts, people have almost universally thought of anarchists in terms of violence and conspiracy. The result has been the regarding of anarchist literature as a product of a handful of criminals. In Europe, the advent of this revolutionary movement was accompanied by a number of sensational acts which led to the identification of anarchism with socially pathological developments. In the United States, there have been similar implications, to the point where even governmental policy incorporated the layman's conception of anarchism and anarchists. The definition of anarchism employed by the Department of Justice in modern times is essentially derived from this earlier period. Although the tendency to blame destruction of property and loss of life during industrial disputes on agitators, doctrinaires, and communists prevailed for some time previous to the celebrated Haymarket incident in Chicago in May of 1886, such predilections received a powerful stimulus from this event. The now familiar stereotype of the black-whiskered, bomb-throwing vandal came into being at this time and created a new political symbol which has been used to manipulate mass opinion with an impressive degree of success. As a consequence of this and other factors, anarchism became so tainted with diabolism that rational study of its place in American history has rarely taken place. General conclusions as to the basis of anarchist opposition to conventionally constituted government have more often than not been based on something less than a scholarly investigation of libertarian literature. To make matters worse, the frame of reference, liberal or otherwise, of most writers who have approached the subject has markedly contributed to promoting attempts to demolish anarchism by the polemical method. We'll go with that. Rather than presenting the record. There has tended to be too much interpretation based on far too little factual data. It was the conclusion of Ernst Victor Zenker, a serious critic of anarchism and writer of one of the few substantial volumes on the subject in the last century, that hardly a critic of anarchism with whom he was familiar had ever read any anarchist writings. Objective writing on the subject is so meager and threadbare that the Encyclopedia Britannica has depended on the anarchist Peter Kropotkin's article for over a generation and a half in presenting the matter of anarchism to the general reader. Surveys of anarchism, such as that contained in Gerald Brennan's The Spanish Labyrinth, are exceedingly rare. The preparation of this study has taken place with most of the foregoing complexities in mind, and is therefore presented with distinct limits upon its scope. It is made with the hope that it may help to establish a method of approach to the problem of any critical survey of the whole radical movement in America. American history reveals a vast amount of native thought and action which may be arranged under the general heading of anarchism, but much of it is so disjointed and sporadic that no comprehensive and logical picture can be constructed from it. It is with the attempt to establish more universal criteria to make possible a more careful examination of anarchism that this study is also concerned. When anarchism in its several forms, including its theoretical statements and practical experiments, is analyzed structurally, it generally separates into three broad areas of tactics and strategy. Those being A, a rejection of constituted authority as the source of social dynamism and equilibrium. B, a refusal to collaborate with the existing order anywhere through participation in any program of reformism. And C, the promotion of a variety of non-coercive alternatives of quite clearly defined nature as a substitute. Within this framework, the various schools of anarchism have developed a number of sectarian variants, and some of these elaborations have created bitter doctrinal controversies. The result has been the erection of barriers fully as steep among the anarchists as those existing between them and the conventional world. The thread of violence which has crisscrossed through this is, however, not an integral part of the fabric. Too often it has been mistaken by superficial observers to be the whole cloth. Nearly all scholarly attention directed toward anarchism in America has been along political lines. With the possible exception of Richard T. Ely and John R. Commons Associates, practically no one has examined the economics of anarchism. This preoccupation with the political has also been responsible for the inclusion in anarchist ranks of several radical fringe groups and individuals who do not belong there. The most important discussion by an American of the politics of anarchism thus far has been that of Charles Edward Merriam. For over 30 years, it has been referred to constantly. The only academic treatise devoted exclusively to anarchism in America, with Eunice Minette Schuster's Native American Anarchism, which appeared in 1931, gives extensive evidence of its influence. Merriam's studies began with an observation of the similarity between anarchist sentiments and the expressions of the antinomian rebels of the 17th century Massachusetts Bay. The narrative was carried through the 18th and 19th centuries, stressing especially Henry David Thoreau, the Garrisonian wing of no government, abolitionists, and a number of religious dissident splinter aggregations, such as the enclaves of John Humphrey Noyce and Aidan Ballou. The survey included a discussion of the individualist mutualist anarchism, concluding with special attention being paid to the imported anarchism which made its way to the United States from Germany and Russia between 1880 and 1905. The attempt to link these varied phenomena into a logical sequence has been undertaken by others as well, with less success. It now appears that the assumption that American anarchism stemmed from Puritan antinomianism, and was associated with the peculiar variety of resistance to the state found in the non-resistant and no-government sentiments of the Garrison school of Christian anarchist abolitionists is untenable. It is more probable that, rather than being a derivative of Native American conditions, the real source of the anti-statist evidences observed in antinomianism, that one's tough, antinomianism, and other varieties of early colonial dissidents and unrest can be discovered in the radicalism, both religious and socioeconomic, already developing in England before the times of Charles I, and which found expression through lower-class spokesmen at the time of the English Civil War. Concerning other aspects of this matter, it can be argued quite effectively that the designation Christian anarchist is really a contradiction in terms, and that religious rebellion along individualist lines can be interpreted as anarchism only under highly specialized circumstances. The rejection of one variety of religious authority in favor of its replacement by another can hardly be related to anarchism, which categorically rejects authority. In another connection, the interpretation of American anti-statism as an evolutionary process passing from religious to economic spheres is also open to serious objections. There is not only lack of continuity and influence, but no logical sequence in the elaboration of a program of propaganda. In searching the field, it becomes more apparent that the elements of a radical movement with a fully developed propaganda structure can be found in one of these sub-areas only. It is the contention of this work that individualist anarchism can be seen to satisfy the requirements mentioned elsewhere. Not only is it the only part of the radical movement native to America with a propaganda, but it has depended on natives for its promotion. Furthermore, it is unique in that members of the group actually attempted under practical conditions to try out its theory. The heavy weight of European influence has concentrated attention on the development of anarchism there. The penetration of this type of revolutionary thought into working class consciousness and its emergence as syndicalism probably justifies this, since in this form it has been the only real competitor to Marxism in the radical arena in the last 80 years. However, paralleling it chronologically was a kindred but nearly unconnected phenomenon in America, seeking the same ends through individualistic rather than collectivistic dynamics. American writers concerned with the reform movements of the 19th century have likewise paid little attention to it, except occasional notice of it as a symptom of economic unrest. its evolution from the practical stages as a frontier experiment in individual sovereignty and equitable commerce to the theoretical and intellectual pamphleteering of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is the major concern here. In the United States, there seems to have been little notice of an extensive literature hostile to the state and its functions until after Haymarket. The dominant conception of anarchism after the violence in Chicago was in accord with the inflammatory utterances of the European-born revolutionaries now gathered in the several large northern cities. Lack of attention had resulted in the failure to note that a serious split had been developing within the worldwide anarchist movement, and that various distinct elements could now be recognized. The semantic smokescreen raised up by the moral uproar here and overseas after Haymarket and a number of sensational assassinations in Europe covered over in the process the uncompromising stand taken by the American individualist anarchists, who deplored the use of force or quote-unquote direct action, and asserted as before their traditional hope of the eventual adoption of non-coercive individualist equity as a result of education and rational conviction. Much of what they had to say had been propagated here for nearly a half century before there developed a competing body of beliefs put forward by followers of Bakunin and Kropotkin. In the form in which it appeared during the 80s and 90s, but especially as broadcast by Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and other Russians after the turn of the century, it is possible to see emerging the full outlines of what has since become known as communist anarchism. It has since received its best statement by Italian and Spanish radicals. Further examination of the famed Haymarket Germans suggests further examination of the famed Haymarket Germans suggests a serious question as to whether these men were not far closer to state socialism, actually, than anarchism. The two groups differed sharply on basic issues. The communist anarchists rejected private property and taught the ideal of the collective autonomous commune. A portion of their number advocated the overthrow of the state by violence. The individualist anarchists held that the collective society in any form was an impossibility without the eventuality of authoritarianism and ultimately totalitarianism, and adhered resolutely to the concept of private property insofar as the term could be defined as the total product of a given individual's labor, but not more broadly than this. They abandoned the idea of equalitarianism utopia and worked for a world free from arbitrary restrictions on opportunity and legal privilege, which breakdowns they claimed laissez-faire really produced. No other radical group denounced the prevailing system more vigorously than the spokesman for individualist anarchism. The individualist anarchists had no blueprint for the future of social organizations under conditions free from coercion. The direction to be taken by voluntary associations was left for the future, and no predictions of a static millennium filled their writings. The group had within their numbers adherents to a system of decentralized local communities of small size, and at the same time proponents of free associations of producers and consumers within large urban industrial centers. The best known of this group of native radicals, Josiah Warren, Lysander Spooner, Stephen Pearl Andrews, William B. Greene, Ezra Heywood, and Benjamin R. Tucker, came in for a measure of attention during the peak of the furor over radicalism reached at about the time of the Spanish-American War. But the greater part of the attention of the time was focused on the German and Russian contemporaries, with whom they were already at variance in many respects. Those most familiar with the individualist suggestions for the solution of the currency, labor, and other pressing problems dismissed them as fulminations of a group of irresponsibles, dreamers, and cranks. Their work along practical lines at any earlier time was practically unknown in any circles, and much of what they had to say later on was mostly forgotten when the stage was taken over by the industrial workers of the world, the Socialist Party, and the First International. In undertaking an exhaustive examination of the whole individualist anarchist movement, the present study produces a number of conclusions and interpretations which differ somewhat from earlier piecemeal studies of anarchist thought and action. A few examples may be given. A full study of the known printed works of Josiah Warren has resulted in the dismissal of the previous assertion that Warren was a son of a celebrated Revolutionary War general. The facts reveal only an intimation of kinship at best. In addition, the former assumptions of Warren's originality in promoting the ticket system of labor note currency does not hold up in the face of repeated admissions by Warren himself of the prior sponsorship by Robert Owen. Warren can be credited only with the first practical adaptation of this system. Previous studies, on the other hand, have tended to overlook the numerous community founding attempts under Warren's instigation, which are fully covered here. The discovery of new materials indicates that Warren and William B. Greene were aware rather than ignorant of each other's work. Greene, generally advanced as an exponent of the ideas of Pierre Joseph Proudhon, appears now to have been more a product of the currency radicalism than accompanied and followed the business and financial panic of 1837. His own ideas, which made a permanent impression on American anarchist economics, stand far closer to the thinking of American contemporaries such as Edward Kellogg rather than Proudhonian, quote-unquote, mutualism. If anything, Greene was more a critic than follower of the famous French radical. A new factor in the person of Joshua K. Ingalls appears as a result of an examination of the origin of anarchist ideas about land, and at the same time, the major figure in the promotion of individualist anarchism in its mature form, Benjamin R. Tucker, becomes less an original and more an eclectic figure. Tucker is the cultural synthesis of the earlier exponents and innovators of the various elements of which this variety of American radicalism was composed. No pretense is made of exhaustively investigating the relationships between individualist anarchism and the large number of contemporary fragments of radicalism, regardless of rationale. Neither Owenism nor Fourierism of the pre-Civil War period, nor the various socialisms and collectivist anarchism of the latter half of the 19th century are treated except where they furnish personalities to the individualist anarchist movement or ideas to the individualist anarchist intellectual arsenal, or opposition to pitch individualist anarchist attacks against. In the history of individualist anarchism, there are peripheral areas. There are distinct and noticeable limitations in the presentation of this monograph, especially as a result of the sparse interpretation and the reluctance to throw the subject of anarchism against the broader backdrop of American social history in a more sweeping and dramatic manner. But it must be remembered that the object sought in this case has not been a comprehensive history of anarchism in America. The emphasis has been upon the careful documentation of its major phase. The basic assumption has been that since the thought and action of the movement has been so elusive and inaccessible, it must be put on record fully before its integration in a more comprehensive account of the intellectual and social history of American radicalism can be effectively undertaken. So, written in Ann Arbor, Michigan by James J. Martin, December 1952. What a stupendous introduction. Just remember that this was written in 1952. So when he's talking like, oh, the last 30 years, all right? Anyways, to this book, to the memory of Agnes Ingalls, an individualist. The table of contents. I think we can probably make it to chapter 3 tonight. All right, the illustrations between, and we'll get to the. So about the illustrations on page 102 and 103 of Josiah Warren, Ezra Heywood, Lysander Spooner, and Benjamin R. Tucker, the history of these photographs is obscure, but their authenticity is without question. Those of Warren and Heywood have never before been published. The publishers are indebted to Lawrence Labadie for his graciousness in supplying the pictures of Spooner and Heywood. The Warren portrait, taken in Boston, probably around 1870, was supplied to the author of this book by the widow of Benjamin R. Tucker, the late Pearl Johnson Tucker, in 1947. There are no other known pictures of Warren. Wow. Details concerning the Heywood and Spooner pictures are unavailable. It is probable that they were also taken in Boston, perhaps between 1880 and 1885. The Spooner picture was published in 1966 in the 1966 reprint of his No Treason and Letter to Thomas F. Bayard. And the photograph of Tucker first was published as the frontispiece to his Instead of a Book in 1893, and would appear to be a likeness of him when he was about 38 or 39 years of age. It was undoubtedly made in New York City. New York City. Chapter 1. Josiah Warren and the Birth of the Equitist Ideal. 20th century America has seen the apparent triumph of the industrial over the agrarian way of life, and the victory of centralized government over the forces of federalism, decentralization, and local rule. In the face of the perennial American fear of big government, with its attending factors of corruption, graft, and gradual escape from the observation of the people at large, the success of this development is somewhat anomalous. The mechanization of industry on a large scale and the accompanying rationalization of productive techniques, along with the impact of machines upon transportation and communication, have been important, if not most important, reasons underlying the decay of direct democracy, and several of the ideals associated with it. In place of a firm belief in the virtues of the average man and his ability to participate in the governing process, there has arisen an attitude toward the complexity of governmental problems consisting primarily of fear and rejection, accompanied by a resignation of responsibility into the hands of ever-growing bodies of impersonal agencies. The result has been an even greater withdrawal of the seat of action from the citizenry, along with a tendency to couch the language of governmental intercourse in highly specialized terms. In the meantime, one observes the development of a mystical respect for governmental specialists. The age of the managerial state has surely begun. The crystallization of the means of political expression in a conventional series of ritual-like gestures has had perturbing repercussions. Their apparent finality has produced apprehension among those people who adhere to Jeffersonian simplicity as a fundamental requirement for the survival of individual liberty and the restriction of institutions to end functions rather than allowing them to become ends in themselves. This removal of much of government from personal scrutiny has resulted in a disturbing apathy toward public affairs on the part of a growing minority of intelligent Americans. Concentration of political power in fewer and fewer hands has not been obstructed by intermittent turnovers of personnel of the quote-unquote house cleaning variety. The replacement of political machines by other political machines has been made apparent repeatedly. This, in turn, has fostered widespread feelings of frustration and cynicism toward the electoral process, which have further contributed to the erosion of basic democratic assumptions. While passivity and withdrawal have been means of countering such developments in the field of political expression, phenomena of a far more aggressive sort have become apparent in other areas of conduct. The influence of technology in promoting a dead level of cultural uniformity has been matched by a growing pressure of insistence upon intellectual and cultural conformity. and the lovers of liberty have been increasingly hard-pressed to escape the sanctions provided for cases of persistent violation. That such a condition has reached the status of a public virtue in bureaucratic and police states where we are becoming more and more aware of. And in America, the struggle to keep professions of radicalism of all kinds from becoming labeled subversive and circumspect continues on a number of fronts. In the United States of Andrew Jackson's day, a rising nationalism was still too loosely interpreted to regard social and intellectual recalcitrancy as a threat to national existence and survival. A large segment of the population looked upon incipient bigness with deep suspicion and continual condemnation. Reform, in all the multi-hued conceptions of the term, was making itself felt in a multitude of ways. Institutions of all types which, in an age of ceaseless mechanical revolution, are clung to with a reverence and fervor somewhat reminiscent of ancestor worship, were being attacked from all sides with a gusto which has rarely been observed since. A welter of reform movements already was penetrating America to its furthest territorial reaches, the ultimate effect being the prevention of a solidification of American thought for almost 2 generations. Only a long and catastrophic civil war was to provide the proper psychological stimulus for a centralization, and an environment being made more favorable toward its growth by technology. The longing for reform on the part of those who sought to make the land a kingdom of God on earth took diverse routes. Peace, anti-slavery, temperance, Bible and tract societies, religious revivalism, women's rights and moral reform. These and a host of lesser agencies created a tremendous intellectual unrest throughout all parts of the country. However, the desire to bring about the millennium took form in other ways than in attempts at political and moral readjustment. Society was fluid enough to tolerate experiments for a reconstruction of the economic order as well. When translated into action, these proposals invariably took the form of independent colonies or communities, experimental in character, striving to become self-contained, and often quite unconventional. Self-sufficiency, in fact, often was the principal objective. Shielded for decades from widespread public notice by better-known radical and reform activities, many of the unorthodox economic and social ideas nurtured in these communities survived their more widely famed, yet more ephemeral contemporaries. Between 1800 and 1850, a bewildering variety of colonies and communities sprang into existence from Illinois eastward to the seaboard. All entertained some element or other of the underlying conviction that spiritual and material well-being were states best brought about through action undertaken by small groups of people of similar minds. At this point, similarity ceased and diversity began. Diversity of such intensity that bitter disputes among the various exponents became an increasing and coercive factor. In the main, the so-called utopian attempts at societary recreation fell into 4 principal groupings. 1, communal villages under the direction of a type of religious patriarchy, of which the repetees of the Shakers form one branch of the authoritarian establishments of John Humphrey Noyce and Aidan Ballou, and other, 2, the planned community order, the leadership of an enlightened philanthropic paternalist like Robert Owen's much discussed in New Harmony being the best example. 3, more broadly based attempts at community or property settlements such as those of Etienne Cabot and Wilhelm Weitling. And 4, and perhaps best known, the Fourier joint stock phalanxes. The latter were most numerous and received most attention from American intellectuals and literary notables during the 1840s. Despite some European influences, this many-sided adventure in socialism is an integral part of 19th century American social, economic, and cultural history. From this formidable mass of communal philosophy and actual experimentation, there emerged a deviant strain of radical thought. Launched on the old Northwest frontier by an uncompromising descendant of colonial forebears, Josiah Warren, his forthright amalgamation of individualism, fear of the state, and economic mutualism has left its mark on the labor and cooperative movements in America and abroad. His dozen and a half published works contributed the essentials for the later fully developed philosophy of individualist anarchism in the United States, as well as making an impression on early American economic and political thought. The details concerning Warren's birthplace and parentage are still obscure. Beyond the knowledge of his birth in 1798, practically nothing of an authoritative nature exists. One thing is quite definite. Nevertheless, sharing an illustrious colonial name did not mean a similar sharing of the general good fortune of the Warren clan. The year 1819 found him making the familiar trek westward and southward down the Ohio, which a vast number of Americans continued to make until the midway point in the century was reached, with the principal aim and view of bettering their economic conditions. Warren and an elder brother, George, had shown considerable promise as musicians while still very young, and had become members of the Old Boston Brigade Band while still boys of school age. When he and his recently acquired wife settled in Cincinnati, Josiah continued to earn his livelihood as a musician and teacher of music, an activity he never completely deserted. The change of locale seems to have sharpened a native intentive genius. Here he began a restless career of invention and innovation in the fields of illumination, printing press manufacture, stereotyping, and musical notation, worthy of closer examination in connection with contributions of the Ohio Valley to the growing industrial consciousness of the nation. His first contribution was a lamp of revolutionary construction, devised to burn lard instead of the much costlier tallow. It had unusual success and led to the construction and operation of a factory devoted to its production, which prospered, lard oil not yet being known. It is highly probable that with this background in bent, Josiah Warren might have become one of the early men of wealth in the growing Midwest, had not the personality of Robert Owen intruded and so impressed him with the exciting and disturbing spirit of social reform. Owen's attempt to remake the pattern of mankind's affairs is doubtless an occurrence without comparison in the social history of the New West. One of the few early industrial millionaires, the Welsh textile magnate and philanthropist, conceived a new world on a scale which was lavish far beyond the imagination of his time. Owen was an environmental determinist. Beginning with the assumption that human nature was a constant, he related all behavior patterns to subsequent reactions to environmental forces. The core of his doctrine was that man's character was a product of exterior stress which he, as an individual, had no appreciable part in forming. Thus, the social system was responsible for its wayward folk. The desirable modes of conduct could be brought about by proper education and supervision. Owen decried the idea of personal responsibility, believing the tenet absurd and productive only of harm. Praise and blame on a personal level formed no part of his working social vocabulary. Having already partially developed his environmental thesis in his model factory town of New Lanark, Scotland, which enjoyed unsurpassed living and working conditions, Owen was determined to put it into operation on an even more striking level, with a new continent as a backdrop. He purchased the colony of Harmony, Indiana, from its founders and occupants, a divergent German Lutheran sect known as Rapites. Rapites? I don't know. We'll go with Rapites. A communal venture with a deeply religious flavor, this group had developed an extensive and strikingly productive estate out of raw wilderness in the Indiana bank of the Wabash River, some 50 miles upstream from its juncture with the Ohio. Desiring once more to return to their earlier home in western Pennsylvania, they sold the tract of 30,000 acres of land and the sturdy buildings thereon to Owen for the sum of $150,000. He then renamed it New Harmony and brought in settlers sympathetic to his philosophy and anxious to experience practical success. It was the largest and most promising experiment in environmentalism in the 19th century. Warren was to know the exhilaration and dejection of the founding and decline of the Owenite interlude at New Harmony before striking out on his own as a social radical. Although unable to hear Owen speak until 1825, he was a member of the first group gathering for the purpose of forming a community of property at the appointed place. By the fall of this same year, he was taking active part in the preliminary society and was a participant in the drafting and approving of the first constitution of the New Harmony Community of Equality in February of 1826. His musical training was soon employed as leader of the community's band. He was long remembered by the first settlers. By the late winter, Warren, his wife, and baby daughter were an established family unit of the settlement and were to remain there for over a year. The collapse and fragmentation of Owen's brilliant assembly took place much sooner than circumstances had given indication. Failure of its main objective was admitted less than a year and a half after the first confident measures towards central organization had been taken. Numerous reasons have been advanced for this. The absence of Owen at critical times, preoccupation with the externals of organization, and petty strife. More important, perhaps, was the fact that too much of the tangible and material portion of the venture represented something for which the rank and file of the community felt no attachment, it being the contribution of the leader and not the product of the labor of the group. Warren made a quick and incisive deduction as to the cause of the debacle, which placed him at once in a camp far removed from that in which the faithful Owenites would henceforth gather. He felt that the common property scheme of the New Harmony colony had been instituted by Owen as a means and not as an end. That what had been desired was a social situation in which the interests of the different individuals would cooperate instead of clash with one another. Even though 30 years of retrospection upon the experience continued to bring back pleasant memories of what had transpired there, the management of financial and property affairs convinced him of the failure of the mission. Quote, but for property considerations, the experiments never would have commenced, end quote, was his pithy summation of the situation. Why did an amicable settlement of material affairs fail to become a reality? Warren blamed it upon the submergence of the individual within the confines of the community. The consequences of such a procedure, said Warren, were inevitable. Not only was individual initiative stifled by failure to provide a place within the structure for personal rights and interests beyond the sphere of religious matters, but the elimination of individual property rights resulted in almost total dissipation of responsibility for the occurrence of individual incapacity, failure, and shortcomings of other kinds. This was not all. He noted that the expressions of natural differences of opinion were increasingly looked upon as unfortunate developments and obstacles to success, which had damaging effect on the continuance of courtesy and tolerance. Thus, despite frequent reorganizations, failures became more abrupt and chaos drew nearer. Warren summed up the whole matter in one vigorous outburst. He said, "It seemed that the difference of opinion, tastes, and purposes increased just in proportion to the demand for conformity, 2 years were worn out in this way, at the end of which I believe that no more than 3 persons had the least hope of success. Most of the experimenters left in despair of all reforms, and conservatism felt itself confirmed. We had tried every conceivable form of organization and government. We had a world in miniature. We had enacted the French Revolution over again with despairing hearts instead of corpses as a result. It appeared that it was nature's own inherent law of diversity that had conquered us. Our quote-unquote united interests were directly at war with the individualities of persons and circumstances and the instinct of self-preservation. And it was evident that just in proportion to the contact of persons or interests, so are concessions and compromises indispensable. Warren went on from this observation to develop a theory based on an assumption of the variable possessions of energy and utility of this energy by different persons. This he never defined with finality, and in keeping with his times, did not include a consideration of the potential impact of irrational motivational drives as a disruption factor. From this observation, he was later to develop a philosophy of anarchism of an extreme individualist type, which not only was a distinctly American contribution to radical thought, but also led to repercussions upon the body of more formal political, economic, and social concepts as well. Although Warren broke sharply with Owen's collective plans for producing the good life, in other respects the cleavage was not so clearly marked. Indeed, his championing of individual sovereignty was to posit a dilemma which was never satisfactorily reconciled. His writings continued to put forth the doctrine of environmentalism, but liberally interleaved with a persistent promotion of belief in free will and individual responsibility, which Owen would have categorically dismissed as prime heresy. Conventional society lost Warren forever, despite all this. For almost half a century, he followed a course of ceaseless activity, attempting several experiments, embracing his own conception of societary reorganization. He never repudiated Owen in an overt way, his attitude toward the founder of New Harmony remaining one of deep respect to his last days. Many years after the break took place, Warren declared, "I owe it to him that my life is of any value to myself or others. No creature ever heard me utter one word that was disrespectful to Robert Owen of Lanark, and although it is with real pain that I undertake to disconnect his mistakes from that which was true in his glorious career, I have a right to believe that no man would more rejoice at my success than Robert Owen himself." Despite the theme of hope expressed in the latter part of this commentary, there is no evidence that the Lanark patron of reform paid any attention to the colorful reform career of his New Harmony protege. And his return to New Harmony in the fall of 1844 was marked by the studious avoidance of Warren and the small knot of adherents gathered around him there. One element of Owen's thought found ready acceptance, in contrast to the lukewarm attitude towards social experimentation. In the hands of Warren and a large number of Warren's followers throughout the remainder of the century, the basic economic doctrine of cooperation met no opposition whatever, despite the serious trouble encountered in putting it into action. This was the proposal to exchange all labor employed in the production of goods and services equally, hour for hour, substituting for the state or privately controlled currency based on metallic commodities as a circulating medium consisting of quote-unquote labor notes. These were simply bills issued in the form of currency, limited in issue and signed by the issuer, promising to furnish labor at specified occupations or activities for specific periods, in exchange for services desired of and rendered by another. These were to be issued on the basis of hours in labor or fractions of hours, depending upon the amount of another's labor consumed. Owen had been mulling over the labor theory of value before coming to America. His 4 essays on the formation of human character, published in New Lanark in 1812 through 1813, contained indications of his wholehearted conversion to this doctrine. The contention that the true price of a thing is the amount of labor expended in its production had been espoused by political economists generations before Adam Smith, although Smith had stated it in classic form in 1776. Owen's labor note idea was a groundbreaking in the direction of practical realization of this idea. And this he also had fully developed in his own mind before reaching New Harmony. Warren became a permanent convert to this new system, propagandizing for its adoption both verbally and through practical attempts for almost 45 years. Its operation was never realized at New Harmony, so Josiah Warren became the first person to employ the device in everyday economic intercourse. His Cincinnati Time Store of 1827 through 1830 became the first scientific experiment in cooperative economy in modern history. Despite its limited objectives as such, as well as its obscurity resulting from the modest, unsophisticated structure employed and the stark utilitarianism which prevailed during its existence. While Warren was forming his own philosophy, rejecting part of Owen's convictions and accepting another part, his New Harmony experiences as a member of the original community of equality were producing other repercussions. His observation of human differences, among other things, shattered his faith in the ideal of economic equality, basing his conclusions on the assumption that different persons put differing amounts of energy and time toward the accomplishments of various ends, and satisfying with the motivational drives which, quote-unquote, enlightened self-interest might supply. He proposed the substitution of the ideal of equal opportunities to the access to land, raw materials, and credit. Equal opportunities being provided, individual differences in completely free competition would gradually work toward the establishment of an equitable society, in which returns would be measured by the amount of work performed, both quantitatively and qualitatively. To Warren, the striving for equity was the highest possible goal of human effort. Warren's complete program was a cumulative affair which did not receive definitive statement for almost 20 years. A part of this period of growth was his growing disregard for constituted authority, partially a product of attachment to a number of attitudes which convinced him that institutional government was a superfluous part of human society. His primary source of dissatisfaction with what he called the quote-unquote communistic experiments in New Harmony was the combination of interests. This combination required, as he saw it, a government based on authority and demanding obedience, which resulted in the death of individual liberty. The alternative which he proposed and crusaded for was a system based on voluntary cooperation, but at no place rising above any individual within its structure. Quote-unquote, the sovereignty of the individual had to be preserved at all costs. This matter he considered more important than any artificial arrangement of individuals which demanded the fidelity of all. There was no compensation which could equate the sacrifice of this principle of individuality. There is a frontier flavor to his own blunt declaration of individualist war upon the hobbling tendencies of institutionalism, which still commands attention. He says, society must be so converted as to preserve the sovereignty of every individual inviolate. That it must avoid all combinations and connections of persons and interests, and all other arrangements which will not leave every individual at all times at liberty to dispose of his or her person, and time and property in any manner in which his or her feelings or judgment may dictate, without involving the persons or interests of others. Using this conception of individualism, then it appeared logical to him then it appeared logical to him that interests, responsibilities, and actions all had to be confined to this level. 1 second. All right. From this point, he carried the analysis into the familiar area which had created the snag at New Harmony: property matters. Assuming that the factors of production were the same for all men, Warren deduced that under such circumstances, sovereignty over one's property was therefore restricted to control over the entire production or material results of one's own labor and nothing more. Such a goal might be rather easily attained in a Crusoe economy, he conceded, wherein a single individual supplied all his own needs. But there already exists a division of labor which considerably complicated the problem of exchange. It would therefore require a different solution to continue to guarantee each individual a total amount of income, however deviously contrived, equal to the product of his original energy expenditure and labor. Anarchist economic thought has continued to express grave concern at this point, holding that this is the original area of injury and discrimination within society. Holding that wealth can be obtained in only two fundamental ways, either by producing it or by taking it from its producer. They maintain that one of these latter actions is involved in all inequitable exchanges. To solve this problem, Warren brought forth the labor exchange idea, which he had absorbed from Owen and which remained firmly planted in his mind. This became his initial action in the effort to promote adoption of a satisfactory method of effecting equitable exchanges, paying little attention to the complexities which had grown upon this branch of human relations through centuries of changing ethical approaches. Nevertheless, an economy based on the exchange of equivalents, or as he termed it, quote unquote, labor for labor, became the basis for the new society he projected. His formula therefore rejected the idea of paying for such goods of the earth as were not the product of human labor. Unlike later adherents to native anarchism, Warren continued to think land a fit subject for sale, an obvious inconsistency. On other matters, which he occasionally referred to as quote-unquote spontaneous fruits of nature, the raw materials derived from labor on the land, he held that such were no more fit subjects for monopoly and sale than sunshine or air. As regards compensation, Warren saw nothing fundamentally wrong with the original Owenite proposal to exchange labor time on an equal hour-for-hour basis. One of the perennial stumbling blocks to the realization of the labor cost theory, the problem of determining the relative intensities in productions of the hours' work being exchanged, did bother him somewhat. But he assumed that the principle of individual sovereignty being preserved at all times, each individual would make what he considered the necessary exceptions for the hour-for-hour yardstick without causing any noticeable disaffection among those involved in the labor exchange group. Josiah Warren was no aimless manipulator of theories. All his life, he manifested a tireless interest in proof through demonstration. Scarcely had the reluctant admission of failure in Indiana appeared in the New Harmony Gazette in May 1827, when Warren gathered his family, his scant goods and savings together, and returned to Cincinnati, anxious to try out his economic scheme in an actual social situation. He decided that the best means of effecting proof of the workability of his views was through the operation of a retail store, observing that such a trial was bound to affect a wide variety of persons, and its operations would thus become a type of laboratory exhibit. The venture was carefully planned. Warren had no intention of continuing in the capacity of storekeeper if what he thought proved to be successful. His intention was to close the store abruptly and begin a model village at once on the outskirts of Cincinnati. The residents he hoped to recruit from among the more enthusiastic of the group of cooperators. This was to be done as quietly as possible, publicity being kept to a bare minimum. His strategy involved the practical demonstration of every element of non-coercive equity on the autonomous local community level in such a manner as to leave no doubt as to their value and practicability. Following the explanation of the manner in which the process had been accomplished, Warren believed that a rapid growth of mutualist villages would take place. Like Robert Owen, he anticipated great things for the betterment of mankind, although the structure he contemplated was far less complex. Thus, the anarchist vision of a world composed of autonomous local communities, in which individuality would be one sacred principle and economic life regulated by the mutual exchange of goods and services on a cost basis, found its expression on the trans-Allegheny frontier 2 decades before similar European conceptions made their appearance. Furthermore, while the present-day modified cooperative movement looks to Rochdale, England, and the earlier London labor exchanges, the first venture in cooperative marketing had an uncontestably American setting, predating either of these more widely known English events, and in some respects providing the inspiration for them. Warren's store had a modest beginning, and actually was only a partially controlled experiment. This is generally true in most similar situations, involving a degree of leaning upon the existing order for 2 principal reasons. 1, initial weakness, and 2, the desire to make the venture as painless a transition from the familiar as possible. Warren had both in mind. Despite his contempt for the conventional method of doing business by functioning within a money economy, he was compelled to resort to a partial dependence upon such himself to make a start. He was not sure that his venture would prove successful. In fact, he had promised himself that should his plan of cooperation on the labor principle show serious flaws or insuperable circumstances, his association with what he termed a, quote, systematic reforms was to be concluded. It is probably because of this half-hidden fear of failure that he made no rash claims nor engaged in the circulating of any type of prospectus. The original stock of the store consisted of $300 worth of groceries and dry goods, which were in greatest demand. Warren posted the bills of purchase within view of all potential customers, that all might see what had originally been paid for the goods on sale. Accompanying them was a notice stating that the cost price would be charged plus a 7% markup. The pay what he called contingent expenses. This constituted the first part of the transaction. He made it plain that no element of the cash price consisted of his profit or return as storekeeper. The customer was first to pay this cost price plus the 7%, which was to defray shipping costs and general overhead of the store. But for the portion which represented his own labor, Warren merely required the customer to present him with a labor note. This note promised to repay an equal amount of time in the customer's occupation to the storekeeper, as he had consumed of the storekeeper's time in effecting the transfer of the purchase of the merchandise. The principal distinction between Warren's store and those of his neighbors was this simple feature: the separation of the merchant's compensation from the cost of the goods sold. Often asked by the people who failed to understand what he was trying to do, why he did not charge a blanket percentage to cover the entire matter of costs and profit, Warren patiently explained that failure to disconnect the two operations would destroy the principle he was trying to illustrate. No percentage could be accurately assigned to serve either the seller's or the buyer's interest. No particular relation existed between the profit and the labor expended in production of the article vended. Thus, for instance, 20% profit on needles would soon result in the storekeeper's ruination. Man, I stink. Ruination, while the same percentage of broadcloth would net him a return of probably $2 for a scant 10 minutes of work. Obviously inequitable. A storekeeper, he went on, might buy and sell 1 barrel or 100 barrels of flour in the same time. Thus, the correct basis upon which he should be paid was solely the amount of time expended in conducting the transaction. Warren was convinced that nothing was superior to the direct exchange of commodities and services. If agreement as to labor content existed, it was preferable to any system involving elements of confidence and risk, which he was convinced the use of currency necessarily provoked. Realizing that specialization and diversity of tastes made this only a partial solution to the continual problem of exchange, the adoption of the labor note paper bills served the function of completing all exchanges not available to settlement by direct exchange. There was a difference in the application of this device by Warren as compared to its original purpose as conceived by Owen. Where the latter had intended it as a means of effecting transactions among the different communities at New Harmony, the former reduced the scope to the local function of a limited currency, but valid among all of those who engaged in any part of the business at the time store. Time store. The name time store was a popular designation, not an original appellation of Warren's, and had come to general use by the end of the 3rd month of the store's existence. The circumstances responsible for this have aroused the interest and curiosity of several commentators, but Warren's own explanation is the clearest. He says, a clock was in plain sight to measure the time of the tender in delivering the goods, which was considered 1/2 of the labor, in purchasing, etc., the other half. An index resembling the face of a clock was fixed just below it, and when the tender commenced to deliver goods, he was to set the index to correspond to the clock. The index would stand still while the clock would run on, and a comparison of the two would show how much time had been employed. This was an innovation. It was to the interest of the customer to take up as little of the storekeeper's time as possible, since time was one of the elements in the price settlement. Thus wrangling and I'm sorry, this is just too much. Thus, wrangling and haggling over prices, which Warren considered a particularly degrading feature of ordinary commerce, was eliminated in time store operations, a matter of considerable significance at a time when such functions were an almost fundamental part of merchandising. Transactions were expedited. This concept is just so funny to me, guys, that it just it's hard to even focus through this, but let's go. Transactions were expedited by the open display of goods and prominence of list prices, another unprecedented feature. It just sounds to me like a guy who just wants to be left alone and he's sick of people taking up time in his store. It's hilarious. It is interesting to note that before the store was terminated, Warren succeeded in reducing the commerce in such staples as flour, meal, beans, beef, pork, and shoes to a modified labor exchange level. A set of actual labor prices based on an average estimate of labor cost of production of each of these commodities evolved, which was posted in the store, and these changed from time to time as labor estimates fluctuated. The partial realization of an economy resting exclusively on exchange of labor notes thus took place independent of the use of legal currency. Warren's unpretentious establishment opened its doors on May 18th, 1827, and after a faltering start produced results which he found highly gratifying. The failure of New Harmony had become common knowledge in Cincinnati by the time Warren expressed his determination to begin his labor exchange store, and his friends begged him to refrain from additional attempts at reform. The promise of financial support in commencing a conventional business venture was of no avail, nor was he inhibited by denunciations of his plan as utopian or visionary, or as just one more of the numerous tricks to aid speculating or swindling which were all too common in the port towns along the water route to New Orleans. Despite all the discouraging factors, the Time Store began operations, and at the end of 3 months had resulted in making an impression in the retail trade of the area, which has since drawn the attention of students of early American economic radicalism. Warren's methods of doing business were adopted by a neighboring merchant, while he declared that the new methods permitted him to sell as much merchandise in an hour as normally was retailed in a day. This increased activity forced him to close part of the day to rest and to furnish information as to how the labor exchange store functioned. There was a mixed reception to the new shop. Some who considered the principles equitable thought them a thing of the future. Others circulated rumors that Warren was an accomplice of big merchants, helping them dispose of their damaged and inferior stocks of goods. One opponent, still remembering New Harmony and the suspicion it had aroused among conservative folk, asserted that Warren was an agent of Robert Owen and had been commissioned to engage in a plot to undermine the United States. No one seemed to realize that Warren's system was a direct blow at the money economy and the power that such a system had in determining the nature of production and the incidence of distribution. The Time Store founder was not to feel the full impact of a large-scale whispering campaign for some time in the future, not until the time of the founding of the much-discussed individualist colony on Long Island. Warren, in his anxiety to extend the labor exchange method in as many ways as possible, gave music lessons in the evenings to young men who understood the operation of the plan and agreed to enter as participants. He and a group of his mutual customers succeeded in securing a teacher for the children who also accepted compensation in labor notes. In 1829, he asserted that 3 physicians had already purchased goods on these same principles, promising professional services on demand. An agnostic, he took pleasure in telling at a later time of an influential Methodist convert to the Time Store principles who had interrupted an argument about a point of faith and charity with the following observation. Well, brothers, people have been disputing for 1800 years about what is true Christianity. Now, if you will go down to the corner of 5th and Elm Streets, you will see it in operation for the first time in the world. Warren borrowed money to aid in the development of the store in its early days, but insisted on giving the lenders notes which were payable on demand. He never explained whether such payments had ever been requested or whether he had ever agreed to pay interest, or how immediate payments was possible if the sum obtained through loan had been invested in fixed capital by the time demand for its return had been made. There is no doubt, however, that he received the necessary backing in view of the prolonged period of operations. Warren was opposed to enlarging the scope of his activities. He stressed continually that he was not attempting to put retail storekeepers out of business, but trying to demonstrate principles of mutualism. He did double the capacity of the original store before the end of the first year, employing the labor of 7 carpenters on the familiar exchange procedure. Still, he insisted on keeping the business on the same simple relationship between keeper and customer and never expanded to the extent of hiring clerks. This action would have been in the nature of a partnership under his conception of the plan, and such combination of interests was diametrically opposed to the principle of individuality which he unequivocally professed. The introduction of still another aspect of labor exchange opened his eyes to other inequalities in the economic system which he believed called for reparation. This was what he called the quote-unquote report of demand. A large sheet of paper was posted on one wall of the store on which those with particular needs made them known, and those with labor and services available for exchange stated the nature of their particular ability or capacity. At the same time, he posted a list of commodities for which he would exchange the time in an attempt to produce a leveling of supply. Warren's conception of the terms supply and demand had little relation to their use in economic terminology of the present day. In his simple system, the declared desire to have a given object constituted demand for it, and no relation whatever to the possession of ability to pay on the basis of theoretical graduated price curves in a money economy. He was convinced that existing economic relationships were exactly reversed in operation to that demanded by distributive justice. The only way to bring about equity was to adapt supply to what he called demand, and thus eliminated the occasion for speculation in human need. The great number of requests for employment in unwanted occupations distressed him considerably, as did the observation that the labor return of children and women was artificially depressed below the level existing among adult men engaged in similar activities. This led to an investigation and condemnation of the apprentice system, which he called an quote-unquote absolute barbarity, a deliberate and artificial restriction of employment which curtailed demand for many services and products. Thus began a full-scale campaign to spread information about all types of skills, a matter of vital concern at a time previous to the widespread adoption of automatic machinery. Warren reasoned that the cost basis economy required the production of all goods at the lowest possible labor cost. This could only be accomplished by the employment of each in the activity he could do best, and therefore cheapest, from the point of view of labor time involved. It was at this time also that he observed another harassing element in the labor exchange operation. This was the problem of determining intensity of relative hours of labor, further complicated by the fact that the most repulsive types of labor were generally the poorest paid. This matter he wrestled with for the remainder of his life, and was never able to satisfy himself as to the best method of solution. Warren's activities in marketing spread over a wide range. He sold almost any product or article which he thought would demonstrate his theory. In all transactions, he attempted a drastic underselling of his competitors to provide the greatest possible contrast between the profit system and the cooperative system. This occasionally involved practices which were not strictly in accordance with equity, such as purchases in wholesale lots, often at public auctions. Such were sacrifices and not exchanges of equivalents. He justified this action by asserting that other retailers bought as much as he, but failed to pass on the saving to their patrons. The Cincinnati Times store was finally liquidated in May of 1830. Warren had long been satisfied that his plan was sound and that he had succeeded in regulating his business by principles without utilizing what he called, quote, the customary machinery of organization, end quote, or the, quote unquote, erection of any power over the individual. In fact, he thought that this had been proven in the first 6 months. The original intent to start communities based on such principles he found more difficult to promote than expected. As early as November 1827, he had contemplated beginning on a holding of 1,500 acres of land in Logan County, Ohio, which had been offered for the purpose by an enthusiast named Samuel Hyde Saunders. Nothing was done at this time, nor even a year later when he considered moving outside the city and forming a model village. A third and final decision to begin a village was made in April 1829. Despite the hundreds of customers who had made purchases in the time store, all involving the acceptance and utility of labor notes, Warren ruefully recalled that only 4 people were ready to take part in this adventure. Warren learned, as had Owen before him, that the inertia of the status quo was a formidable antagonist to such a sweeping reorganization of human affairs as he entertained. He was too practical to think that such a plan as he proposed could succeed if supported only by the poor, the needy, and others at the bottom of the economic ladder. Even though it was one of the principal reasons for starting in the first place, to eliminate the perpetuation of this byproduct of what he called legalized cannibalism. He remarked that hundreds were interested in his proposition who were too poor to afford the loss of the month's income which removing and changing positions would occasion. Others had different objections. Some feared an inability to obtain employment under the new conditions. Others did not look favorably upon the equitable compensation of women and children, or the proposal to teach the secrets of carefully guarded trades in a few days or weeks. Those with means admitted in private conversations the worth of some of his proposals, yet abstained entirely from offering assistance. Warren was aware of criticism of his local ideas on the basis of their being ahead of their time, as well as their assumed impracticability due to the lack of persons capable of living on such an advanced and enlightened level. What he did not realize, apparently, was the reluctance with which people were willing to part with present security, no matter how faint the degree, in exchange for the unknown, no matter how promising. Willingness to participate in such a proposal as he advocated on the limit scale of a store was a far different matter from the formidable design to erect a new structure of society in a raw wilderness without any of the reassuring comforts of familiar institutions or material standards to which had already become accustomed and conditioned. The enthusiasm which he encountered while operating his store was still too closely tied to the hope of individual gain from some part of the transaction in the minds of many of the participants. Hardy spirits, always willing to leave the confines of the community, usually were motivated in a similar manner, an attitude toward which Warren was thoroughly opposed. The distaste for this selfish type of individualism remained with him from the time of the community experiences at New Harmony, and he never was able to tolerate it thereafter. Under the Warrenite approach, economic prominence was obtained under the labor for labor plan through superior utilization of the individual's own energy, not through the manipulation of various factors of the economy to produce an income unearned by actual labor. Warren felt at the time that those who participated in his time store still lacked the capacity to understand the nature of the proposals that he had explained them. The way he had explained them, Many years later, however, he became convinced that, looking back on the wreckage of several community attempts, failure had been due more to the planned efforts of an element among the business community, which he claimed had everywhere created difficulties and placed obstacles in the way of the success of his nonprofit community projection. In spite of the mounting gloom occasioned by the unresponsiveness of his former cooperators to the call to form a village, the plan was perceived in, and the land was selected upon which to move in the spring of 1829. At this point, the strange interlude of Warren's relations with Robert Dale Owen and Frances Wright occurred. Owen, the gifted son of the New Harmony patron and the brilliant Scotswoman, champion of the dozen unpopular causes ranging from Negro equality to anti-clericism, clericalism, had moved the center of operations of the intellectual radical movement associated with New Harmony from Indiana to New York City. There, they had renewed publication of the celebrated community news organ, the New Harmony Gazette, under the name The Free Inquirer, devoting most of the space now to the propagation of the general sentiments of free thought, with generous portions of acrimonious controversy with adherents of various brands of orthodoxy as a special feature. Although more concerned with their protracted joust with biblical fundamentalists, and in particular the wave of emotional revivalism that then sweeping through some elements of Protestant tongue-tied Protestant I can't even say it. Whoa, man. Protestantism. The two young liberals retained a sympathetic interest in all attempts at community organization. This was understandable, since most of the activity during this period was primarily a backwash of the present essay at New Harmony. I can't even say it if I try. Protestantism. The Ohio activities of Josiah Warren had attracted the attention of the land and labor reform press of New York City, where slums were already a problem and depressed segments of the population a feature of the urban social structure. It is not unusual, then, to find the editors of the Free Inquirer becoming concerned to the point of proposing collaboration in achieving the aims of Warren's non-political scheme for alleviating the evidences of economic distress which had come to his attention during the few years of his reform career. Owen prevailed upon Warren to postpone the beginning of his new community in Ohio in favor of a similar beginning in the vicinity of New York. This was made to appear extremely attractive through the promise of considerable financial and material support already at the former's bidding. Owen, as had his father, had in mind a much larger unit than Warren. This was apparently to be publicized through a press campaign, intending no doubt to include the pages of the Free Inquirer in a broad program of propaganda to advertise its potential advantages. Dazzled by this offer, Warren abandoned the proposed movement to the outskirts of Cincinnati, and thus the decision came about to continue the time store into a third year. Owen's existing business precluded the immediate start of the New York village, and what was intended to be a temporary lull dragged on. Thus, the time store celebrated a third anniversary before Warren liquidated the remaining stock and began the momentous journey to New York, anticipating memorable results. But still another delay intervened. Owen was called to Europe, and the plans languished. Yet there still remained a strong spirit of affirmation of the previous support of Warren on his part, and that of Fanny Wright as well. The Free Inquirer continued to express confidence in the eventual success of a Warrenite colony, and Warren himself was still hopeful, but the summer found him somewhat subdued. In mid-July, he addressed a communication to his Cincinnati associates, confessing that nothing tangible had been accomplished, but asserting that the call to begin practical operations would come at an early date. All right. So we'll continue chapter 2 probably tomorrow night, and then we'll just play it by ear from then on out. But this is a fun book so far. It's pretty deep information there. There's some, my camera is all messed up. God damn it. So I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in. It was kind of a rough one, but we got through it. I gotta mess with my camera settings. and then we'll be able to go forward. I don't know what the heck happened to them. So, in any case, that shit doesn't matter. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm James Cordiner. This has been Voluntarist Academy. Of course, we got Brendan Daniel to play us out as usual, and then check out the show notes and go to voluntaristacademy.com if you found value in this and you think that that this is good. You can promote this and so like and subscribe, do all that stuff, blah 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 blah. And that's the easiest way to support the channel. I thank you all for your support. Autonomy season 13 is kicking up pretty soon. You guys should go check out Autonomy and get in there. Get autonomy.info. Click on the link in the show notes because it's an affiliate link, and if you end up enrolling, it helps me. So thank you very much, and that's about it. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.
Jesus.